In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. In January of 2023, the Sheriff's Department in Jasper, Alabama, released a statement, quote, "On Thursday, January 27th, an inmate in the Walker County Jail was provided with a routine medical check by jail medical staff. Medical staff determined the inmate needed to be transported to the hospital for further evaluation. The inmate was alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital. Shortly after arrival at the hospital, the inmate suffered a medical emergency and became unresponsive. Life-saving efforts were performed by hospital staff and the inmate was ultimately revived. Unfortunately, a short time later, the inmate passed away." The inmate was Anthony Mitchell. He was arrested on January 12th and spent 14 days at the Walker County Jail. 1 year after his death, a coroner ruled his death a homicide. The Walker County Jail tried covering up Anthony Mitchell's death, but in doing so, they put on a national stage the jail's history of inmate deaths, horrific conditions, and the culture that allowed it to continue. If it weren't for one correctional officer who knew something was wrong, for the community organizers fighting for justice, and for the families of victims continuing to speak out, we might not know what we know today. So let's talk about what's happening at the Walker County Jail. Let's start with Anthony Mitchell. Anthony Mitchell, who was known to those close to him as Tony, was 33 years old. And at this point in his life, Tony was really struggling. Up until late 2022, Tony had lived with his father in Carbon Hill, Alabama, a short drive from Jasper. But on August 31st, 2022, Tony's father passed away, leaving him to live alone in the house. At this time in Tony's life, like many Americans, he struggled with drug addiction, and the death of his father appears to have exacerbated the situation. Tony's struggles came to a head on January 12th, 2023. That afternoon, Tony went to his cousin Steve's home. Now, Steve had last seen Tony just a few months prior at Tony's father's burial, but the man Steve saw at his door was unrecognizable. Tony was around 6'3" tall, and Steve guessed the last time he saw him, he was probably over 200 pounds. But the evening of the 12th, Tony appeared completely emaciated, weighed maybe 150 pounds tops. Tony wasn't wearing shoes, and he looked completely disheveled. Tony arrived at Steve's house and said he had a secret to tell him that no one else knew. Tony told Steve that he had a brother who was stillborn, which was technically true. Tony's mother had a stillborn baby boy 5 years prior to Tony's birth, but Tony was having severe delusions based around this. Tony believed that the stillborn baby's body was in a box in his attic, which was obviously not true, but Tony believed this and said he needed to tear out a wall in his attic to find the box. Now, he believed he needed to do this because there were, in Tony's mind, 2 portals in his home, one to heaven and one to hell. He believed he needed to find this box and put it into the portal to heaven so his baby brother could be there with his father. So Steve, obviously at this point, taking in Tony's appearance, his delusions in this story of a box in his attic, he knows that Tony is in serious need of psychiatric help. Now, Steve doesn't want to leave Tony by himself, and he wants to try to help him. So Steve and his adult son go to Tony's home, and they even go up into the attic with him to try to show Tony there's nothing up there. But Tony insists and said again that he needs to tear out a wall. So Steve and his son left, and they told Tony they were going to go get tools to help him with the wall. But they were really going to try to find him some help. They first attempted to contact the Walker County Sheriff's Department, but they couldn't reach anyone, so Steve eventually calls 911. Steve asks the 911 dispatcher if someone could go and check on his cousin. He told the dispatcher about the delusions and that he appeared to be having a mental breakdown. The dispatcher asked Steve if an ambulance was needed, and he said that would be a good idea. These are the events that are leading up to Tony's arrest. And I want to bring this up because I think it's really important to understand that it was clear and very obvious from the beginning that Tony needed help. So sheriff's officers arrive at the house and they encounter Tony in this state that we've discussed and in very obvious need of psychiatric help. But things very quickly escalate when police arrive. This is one area where there is not a lot of information, so it is unclear why exactly things took such a quick and negative turn. I know many have requested body camera footage. I have requested that myself, but it hasn't been released. The sheriff's office posted a statement on Facebook, and a part of it read, "When deputies arrived, they observed Mitchell in the front yard of the residence. Mitchell immediately brandished a handgun and fired at least one shot at deputies before retreating into a wooded area behind his home." Now, more officers arrive, a SWAT team arrives, and Tony is eventually arrested in the woods behind his home. In my research on this case and looking through the various lawsuits and plea agreements, I haven't found anything else on the incident of Tony brandishing a handgun. The only thing I have on that is just in the descriptions of what led up to Tony's arrest. One thing to note, when Tony was arrested, the sheriff's office public information officer, TJ Armstrong, took a photo of Tony being apprehended and posted it on social media, specifically on their official Facebook page. Now, they have since taken this photo down, but it is still out there. I have seen it myself. And there is no reason I can think of for why they would have taken and released this specific photo other than to publicly humiliate Tony at such a low moment in his life. In the photo, you can clearly see he is in distress. You can see he's disheveled, and he has a black substance, like maybe paint, all over his face. And later on, Steve was told by Armstrong that Tony said he spray painted his face black because he planned to enter this portal to hell located inside of his house. I mean, just Officer Armstrong saying this, they all knew that he needed help. They knew he was having delusions. So after Tony's arrest, Steve spoke with Armstrong, and Armstrong said that Tony was a little roughed up and that they were going to set Tony's bond so high that he wouldn't be able to bond out, and said that he'd receive medical evaluation when he got to the jail and that, quote, "We're going to detox him and then we'll see how much of his brain is left." So this really, I think, sets up the foundation to understand the kind of environment that Tony was being taken into. That despite him clearly needing medical attention, he was right off the bat treated with very little dignity or humanity. Now, I want to skip forward 14 days to the day that Anthony Mitchell died. We will go over the days leading up to his death and the conditions he was forced to endure. But for now, I think it's important to jump forward and talk about the day that he died and the attempted cover-up by the Walker County Sheriff's Office. I want to remind you of the statement the Sheriff's Office put out following his death. Quote, "On Thursday, January 27th, an inmate in the Walker County Jail was provided with a routine medical check by jail medical staff. Medical staff determined the inmate needed to be transported to the hospital for further evaluation. The inmate was alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital. Shortly after arrival at the hospital, the inmate suffered a medical emergency and became unresponsive. Life-saving efforts were performed by hospital staff and the inmate was ultimately revived. Unfortunately, a short time later, the inmate passed away." First, I just want to point out, it was actually January 26th that Tony died, but that's just a typo. That's not what I want to focus on. What we need to focus on are some specific parts of the statement. An inmate was provided with a routine medical check. The inmate was alert and conscious when he left the facility. Shortly after arrival at the hospital, the inmate suffered a medical emergency and became unresponsive. Life-saving efforts were performed by hospital staff, and the inmate was ultimately revived, but a short time later, the inmate passed away. This is what the public received. They don't know who the inmate is. They don't know the state he was in, nothing. So you read this, and it just reads as though a nurse did a check, something didn't look right, but ultimately things went wrong at the hospital, and that's that. But nearly everything in this statement is false and can be proved false through video surveillance, through medical records, and the eventual corroboration from officers working at the jail. So let's take a look at what the doctors noted at the hospital when Tony arrived shortly after 9 a.m. on January 26th. A doctor from the emergency room made the following note, which is in Tony's medical records. I'm going to read this directly, so there might be some kind of grammatical errors. I'm just going to read it directly as it is. So, quote, I have limited information on this patient other than was provided by sheriff's deputies that accompanied the patient to the hospital. I was told by one of the deputies that the patient has been incarcerated since January 12th. I was also told by the deputies that the patient has not been eating or drinking for several days. He was brought to the emergency room by sheriff's deputies in a car for evaluation. One of our nurses noted the sheriff's moving the patient out of the vehicle and putting him in a wheelchair, and he went outside and offered to move him to a stretcher. At that point, he was noted to have atonal respirations, breathing 2 to 4 times a minute. He was rushed to the ER and moved to our stretcher. He was unresponsive, apneic, and pulseless, and cold to the touch. CPR was started and handcuffs were removed. His mother arrived in the emergency room about 3.5 hours into resuscitation and gave additional history. She said her son had been drug addicted for years. He has developed multiple abscesses. He has been suicidal. He is recently been confused. She has not heard from him in weeks. She requested that we not continue resuscitation. Another medical note states, quote, patient was unresponsive, but occasionally made some agonal movements, including swallowing and minor movements of an arm or leg. This is while CPR with external compression devices in progress. Initial rectal temperature was 72 degrees Fahrenheit. He appeared to have vomitus on his uniform. 2 separate officers say in reports that they filed that once they got to the hospital, Tony was sitting upright, grunting, blinking, and responsive. This is entirely contradicted by medical reports and video surveillance, which we will get into later. Other statements in Tony's medical records state no spontaneous pulse was ever palpated, and there was never any purposeful movement or response to pain. In another note, the doctor writes, I am not sure what circumstances the patient was held in incarceration, but it is difficult to understand a rectal temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit while someone is incarcerated in jail. The cause of his hypothermia is not clear. It is possible he had an underlying medical condition resulting in hypothermia. I do not know if he could have been exposed to a cold environment. I do believe that hypothermia was the ultimate cause of his death. Anthony Mitchell was declared dead on Thursday, January 26, 2023 at 1:15 p.m. at Walker Baptist Medical Center. At some point during this day, Officer Armstrong, the Sheriff Department's public information officer, called Tony's cousin Steve and said for the last week and a half, quote, we've had a time with Tony. He told Steve Tony refused to eat, refused to speak to anyone, and allegedly refused to consent to a psychiatric evaluation. He claimed that at one point Tony had thrown feces on jail staff, and that morning Tony's temperature started to drop, and they had to bring him to the hospital. He told Steve to bring Tony's mother in because, quote, Tony is not going to live. Now, none of the officers, including Armstrong, ever mentioned to hospital staff that Tony's temperature was dropping. The hospital staff only found out after beginning to resuscitate him. Armstrong also told Steve that doctors asked Tony to sit up, and when he did, he had a massive heart attack. None of this is included in his medical records from that visit to the hospital. This appears to be an outright lie. Now, Sheriff Nick was apparently personally at the hospital and spoke with the Mitchells. He didn't mention anything about Tony being hypothermic or how he had gotten to the condition he was in. No, he said he heard Tony had been looking a little peckish that morning and seemed dehydrated. He also again reiterates that the medical emergency occurred after their arrival at the hospital. Just over 1 year after Tony's death, the coroner determined Tony's cause of death was, quote, hypothermia and sepsis resulting from infected injuries obtained during incarceration and medical neglect. The manner of death is specified as homicide. So, what happened here? How does a man go from being arrested and in need of obvious and serious medical attention to dying of hypothermia and sepsis just 14 days later, with his death being ruled a homicide? I want to talk about the conditions that Tony was forced to endure while incarcerated at the Walker County Jail, and the multiple instances where jail staff neglected or outright refused to provide Tony with any ounce of dignity or care, including the hours prior to his death. Let's go back to January 12th, 2023, the day that Tony was arrested. Tony was brought to the Walker County Jail on January 12, 2023. Upon arrival, he was put in a wheelchair and brought to a dressing area to change from what he had been wearing into a jail uniform. He wasn't capable of dressing himself, and after several attempts to get him into a standard jail uniform, officers ended up wrapping him in a suicide smock, which they referred to as a turtle suit, despite no indication that he was suicidal and no instructions to treat him as if he were suicidal. Tony was wheeled to the medical unit, but according to the civil suit filed by the Mitchell family, a nurse told correctional officers she wanted to wait and not administer the fit for confinement screening. He was also not provided with a medical screening, and according to a correctional officer, Tony likely received zero medical attention, evaluation, or care until the day he died. Tony was placed in cell BK5. This cell was not meant for the long-term holding of an inmate. It was an isolation cell located in the booking area and was referred to as the drunk tank. The purpose of the cell wasn't to house detainees, but to temporarily hold them during the booking process. Anthony Mitchell was in this cell from January 12th until the 26th. He was there for 2 weeks. BK5 did not have a bed. And while video shows Tony initially had a mat and possibly a blanket for sleeping, it was eventually taken away, leaving him to sleep on a concrete floor. This cell did not have a toilet, but only a drain in the floor. This drain could only be used for liquid waste, not solids. Additionally, the liquid waste would not go down the drain unless a button was pushed on a wall located outside of the cell. This means any waste would build up on the floor of the cell until that button was pushed. The cell had no sink, meaning he didn't have readily available water. At some point during his time at the Walker County Jail, the suicide smock he was wearing was taken away and was never replaced. Throughout most of his stay, Tony was seen lying on the bare concrete floor, nude, in a cell that was a mess, full of feces and backed up sewage from the drain on the floor. During Tony's 14 days in the cell, he was brought out to use the shower a total of 6 times, and his cell was cleaned only 4 times. On the occasions he was brought out for a shower, Tony's naked body was visibly soiled with feces, as was his cell for most of his confinement. On January 15th, surveillance video shows Tony, naked, being dragged out of the holding cell and being tased by a correctional officer. I don't have any information about why he was tased, but the tasing caused Tony's teeth, which were fake teeth, to fall out. Rather than allowing Tony to put his teeth back in, they were placed in a property bag labeled with that date and returned to Tony's mother following his death. From January 15th until his death, Tony would not have been able to chew solid food. During Tony's time at the Walker County Jail, he was provided with 3 meals a day, usually in a brown paper sack called a suicide sack. These contained no beverages and no utensils. Tony, nude, unable to chew solid food without his teeth, and who was in a cell with no bed and urine and feces on the floor, had to eat food with his hands. Multiple instances were documented where staff refused to provide Tony with medical attention. I am going to read a couple of excerpts from the Mitchell family lawsuit. In these excerpts that I'm going to read, they're coming from a couple other plea agreements, and in those agreements, they refer to various people as jailer number 1, co-conspirator number 2. I will use their name in the instances that I know what their name is. Otherwise, I will just read directly from the suit and use whatever label they have in it. But in these excerpts, Anthony Mitchell is referred to as individual number 1. Now, these excerpts are relating to an individual who worked at the Walker County Jail. In this one, the last name is Wires. Now, Wires was a nurse practitioner and has since entered into a plea agreement in federal court in a criminal prosecution relating to Tony's death. As part of that plea agreement, Wires asserted the following as facts. As far as defendant Wires knows and believes, Anthony Mitchell was never on suicide watch and was not suicidal while he was in the jail. The medical staff keeps a suicide watch list so that they can provide necessary observation and services to those identified as suicidal. Anthony Mitchell was not on the list. No medical provider at the jail had treated him, and he was treated more severely and unlike others who had been on the list prior to and during his incarceration. I bring this up because if you recall, Tony was put in a suicide smock and his food was given to him in a suicide sack, despite no record of him being on suicide watch. Continuing. Shortly after Anthony Mitchell was arrested and booked into the jail, defendant Wires became aware of his mental health needs. The jail's nurse practitioner contacted defendant Wires to specifically request that they conduct a psychiatric consultation with Anthony Mitchell, reflecting the nurse practitioner's concerns about Anthony Mitchell's mental health needs and putting defendant Wires on notice of those needs. By the evening of January 13th, 2023, defendant Wires became aware from someone who worked inside the jail that Anthony Mitchell was complaining of being cold and looked sick and unable to care for himself. Wires worked on January 17th and saw that Anthony Mitchell was naked in BK5 without bedding and was disoriented and incoherent. Jailer number 1 denied defendant Wires access to individual number 1, claiming that individual number 1 was, quote, too combative. However, defendant Wires never witnessed him being combative or aggressive in any way and believed that jailer number 1's justification was false and designed to punish Anthony Mitchell. The suit goes on to say that defendant Wires understood from prior experiences in the jail that jailers would punish detainees for conduct committed outside of the jail, including where they had allegedly been violent towards law enforcement. Later in the suit, it says, quote, unlike jailer number 1 on January 17th, 2023, jailer number 2 on January 24th offered to escort individual number 1 to the medical unit for examination by defendant Wires. But again, Wires refused to provide care to individual number 1 despite his objectively obvious need because he had no interest in providing care to someone he thought was unworthy of it, and because he feared job ramifications if he offered care against the perceived, quote, prevailing culture. Specifically, Wires was reluctant to take any steps that would be construed as providing assistance to Anthony Mitchell for fear that jail command staff would ask the medical contractor he worked for to move Wires to a different jail further from his home, which would be inconvenient for him. As a note on the culture here, in another plea agreement, there is a bit that states the following. Moreover, defendant Jones and these co-conspirators repeatedly made comments during the first few days of Anthony Mitchell's detention to the effect of, Mitchell should have been killed because he shot at deputies rather than being brought to the jail, that they would have killed him if they were the ones responding to the welfare check, and that road deputies should have killed him rather than making the correctional officers have to deal with incarcerating him. So we talk about the prevailing culture. in this jail. And I know that this is something that is pervasive throughout law enforcement. If an inmate is thought to have harmed police officers, if they are alleging that Anthony Mitchell shot towards police officers, the culture here is clear. You will not provide this inmate with help. You will not provide him with assistance. And it's clear that the correctional officers there didn't even think that he should be allowed to live. There is no presumption of innocence here for Anthony Mitchell. He hadn't even gone to trial. He probably hadn't even met with his lawyers yet. But they are treating him inhumanely. They are denying him access to care. And this is all due to the culture in this jail. At the time of his second visit, Wires believed that the totality of circumstances surrounding the detention of Anthony Mitchell posed serious threats to his health and well-being and were contributing to his deterioration. He also recognized that Anthony Mitchell was being treated differently than other detainees who had been placed in booking or detainees who had actually been placed on suicide watch. As such, Defendant Wires concluded that holding individual number 1 in cruel conditions without access to medical and mental health care was purposeful, and he purposefully joined in that effort. He took no steps to alert the jail's command staff or those in the medical contractor's chain of command to the conditions in which Anthony Mitchell was housed, or his need for medical or mental health care. As such, he did not take reasonable steps to address the objectively harmful conditions that he witnessed or fostered. In Defendant Wires' words, "I fell beneath the standard of care that was expected of me." Now, those snippets were just highlighting a couple of the employees of the jail and how they knew that Tony needed help but refused to provide it. As of recording this, so late February of 2025, at least 9 jail staff have pled guilty in criminal cases relating to Tony's death. One of the correctional officers who has pled guilty admitted in their plea agreement that he and others intentionally kept Tony's cell as filthy as possible to show a Walker County commissioner how, quote, crazy and disgusting some inmates were, to try and convince the commissioner that the jailers needed more pay. In an article by WBRC talking about this revelation, one paragraph reads, "Shoemaker asked co-conspirator number 1 about why Mitchell was being treated differently and was given a non-responsive answer, according to federal records, which Shoemaker understood as, co-conspirator number 1 did not want Mitchell to receive medical treatment, either to punish him for what Mitchell was accused of doing that prompted his arrest, or to hide anything that might have been done to Mitchell by those who arrested him." This WBRC article goes on to talk about the plan to purposefully leave Tony in awful conditions to attempt to get a raise. It says, 2 days before Mitchell's death, a Walker County commissioner planned to tour the jail to see working conditions for the officers. Shoemaker told federal investigators he and others, quote, intentionally left Mitchell's cell as filthy as possible so co-conspirator number 1 and defendant Shoemaker could use Mitchell and his cell as a prop to show the commissioner. But their plan changed when someone who wasn't aware of the plan cleaned Mitchell's cell prior to the commissioner's visit. Consequently, the article says, they adjusted their plan by convincing a different detainee in the jail's booking area to, quote, act crazy when the county commission visited. Shoemaker awarded that detainee with a pack of honey buns. Absolutely crazy. We are going to take a break here, but next week in part 2, we are going to go in depth into the hours before Anthony Mitchell's death and what the officers at the Walker County Jail did and did not do. We will then get into how this cover-up by the Walker County Sheriff's Office came to light. So stay tuned for more. That will all be next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself.